Now, the challenges that we face as a nation are truly global. Climate change, resource scarcity, growing inequality, conflict, the mass displacement of people. In order to meet these challenges, we have to have a global view. We need to move away from those old polluting industries of last century that are destabilising our world. We need to move towards greater regional cooperation and where we demonstrate real leadership in addressing these challenges. Over the course of the Abbott, now Turnbull government, we've heard a lot about the threats to our national security. The government's gone to great lengths to counter the threat of violent extremism. We've seen the cancelling of passports of Australian citizens, the implementation of new national terrorism threat advisory systems, and we've seen billions of dollars poured into the funding into our national security agencies. We of course recognise that violent extremism is a threat to Australia, and it's a growing issue globally to which we have to respond. But all of the evidence suggests that the greatest gains will be achieved by addressing conflict and extremism at its source, using diplomatic channels to pursue a global response to a global problem. And on that measure, I think the government hasn't achieved what it could have achieved. But its biggest failure, the Abbott-Turnbull government's biggest failure, is its pig-headedness in refusing to acknowledge that global warming and all of the things that flow from that, poverty, scarcity of resources, instability and the conflict that it creates, represents a much bigger threat to our national security. Now, don't just take our word for it. John Powers, a US Iraq veteran and advisor to the Obama administration, has said, in the security world, decisions are made by a careful evaluation of risk, and climate change is the mother of all risks. Now, in the US, this is a consensus statement. It's not controversial. The Department of Defence has openly declared global warming an urgent and growing threat to our national security. We've got the Pentagon, we've got NATO member states and the G7 all taking seriously the threat of global warming and the threat that global warming poses to national security. We've got Dr. Chris King at the US Army Command, who put it this way: we aren't prepared for a 100-year war, and that is the scale and breadth of what climate change presents. History confirms that nobody knows how to win a 100-year war. Now, compare that to the Australian government's 2016 Defence White Paper, which barely mentions global warming and certainly doesn't identify it as a threat to national security. So while you've got top brass in the US being issued with directives to make global warming a priority, you've got the Australian government with its head in the sand. In a recent interview, President Obama said that ISIS is not an existential threat to the United States. Climate change is a potential existential threat to the entire world if we don't do something about it. Now, of course, this isn't to minimise the threat of ISIS, but it is a recognition that global warming left unchecked is a direct threat to our very existence. And it takes a hell of a lot of courage to make a statement like that when the fight against ISIS is front and centre in the minds of many governments and their citizens, particularly in the US. But leadership requires courage. Global warming is a threat multiplier. It exacerbates drought, famine, displacement, food and water scarcity, and disease. As, again, the President of the United States said, this makes every other problem we've got worse. That's above and beyond just the existential issues of a planet that starts getting into a bad feedback loop. Now, we're already seeing drought-stricken farmers in northwest Kenya fighting each other for water and cattle. We're seeing environmental changes fueling violence and military conflict in Afghanistan, India and Pakistan. We've got climate crises in rural areas and destroyed farmland and coastal zones that are pushing people into urban drug wars in Brazil and Mexico, all documented. We've got a study published in Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences that says that extreme drought in Syria between 2006 and 2009 was most likely due to global warming, and that the drought was a factor in the violent uprising that began in 2011. This is the future if we continue on the government path of inaction on global warming. This is the future that we face. Yet there we were on the first day of an election campaign with the Prime Minister saying that having an ambitious climate reduction target would reduce our leverage in international obligations. Well, what nonsense. What a remarkable revelation, completely misunderstanding the way those global negotiations work. And having been in Paris, I can tell you when those negotiations were occurring, we are an outsider in the global climate movement. We've chased off foreign investment in clean energy, and we've reduction targets that would keep us as the worst per capita polluter in the world, tied with that wonderful climate champion, Saudi Arabia. Now, we realise that setting ambitious targets sends a signal to the global community. It says we're serious about transforming our economy, and to do that we need to have serious targets. So we have a science-based target of 60 to 80% reductions below 2000 levels by 2030, and we want to get to net zero emissions by 2040 at the latest, to avoid the fast approaching tipping points which President Obama talks about, from which there will be no safe return. So this isn't just about preserving our environment or transforming our economy, but as the American Defence Forces said, it is about preserving our national security as well. The impact of global warming is going to fundamentally change the character of our foreign relationships. The science is crystal clear. We have to keep global warming to below 2 degrees, preferably below 1.5 degrees, to avoid catastrophic climate change. And to get this done is going to require an unprecedented commitment. To fail on this front means unprecedented global and regional instability.